It was like my mom who told me about your show because like I love musical theater and I'm a Joyce scholar. So she was like, what are the chances?
I was just curious, and when did you become interested, or how did you become interested in Joyce, and how did this become a passion project for you?
Yeah, for sure. So right now I'm doing my Master of Arts in English, and Joyce is sort of my hub. I'm the Joyce person in my cohort. And then this project is for a public scholarship class. So our final project, it was very like open-ended, just like go do something that brings your work to people other than your classmates. So
Very cool.
yeah. What is the most memorable conversation that you've had about James Joyce?
Before 1997, no, maybe even earlier, 1996, I had never read Joyce. And I just knew of him, and it was like, oh, something I'm never going to touch or delve into, right?
Mhm.
And I was invited to a reading that was there was a gentleman named of Len Cariou, and Len was the original Sweeney and Sweeney Todd, and he was doing readings from Ulysses and had a notion of the play idea. It was a combination of Ulysses and a little bit of Joyce's life. And so I was invited as a composer lyricist to come and see what I thought, because which I found out later, Joyce was a tenor, and sang with McCormick, and on stage actually with McCormick, and Nora actually wished that he had become a singer and not a writer.
Wow.
But I was so taken in by by the world. Then I wound up developing the show about him. So what I spent a lot of time is and yes, I've read everything except Finnegan's, and I just haven't had the time to do that yet. Being a late bloomer to no pun intended, a late bloomer to Mr. Joyce, but the most interesting conversation, to answer your question, was after I had developed this show and we'd already had a production, but it was kind of like a biopic thing that I was just, there was something missing. And I was researching and talking to my director at the time and realized that Joyce had died 15 minutes before Nora got back to his hospital room. And all of a sudden, that became the most interesting conversation, because it gave me a frame of, okay, so what would Nora have wanted to have heard in those missing 15 minutes? And so that became the most interesting conversation, because it made me imagine, all right, well, let's start at Joyce's wake, and let's just imagine that Nora starts yelling at the body before leaving, before she had the chance to say goodbye, and to find out everything that she needed to find out. And so we were off on a Joycean kind of, jaunt, and the body answers her, and they have this whole argument, and she goes over, in Irish Catholic tradition, you open the window to let the soul escape. And so she goes over to after they go back and forth, and you hear them banter, and you hear them, be sexy with each other, fight with each other, just, like what couples do. But, and they were very, they were a hot couple, in their youth. And so you see all of this in this opening, and finally she goes over to the window, slams it shut, and says, "You're not going anywhere till I hear the words I want to hear." And so so that conversation led to this whole imagining of, in my imagination, there would be no James Joyce without Nora Barnacle. And Nora Barnacle was the portable Ireland, was the Gaelic woman, where Joyce was this, stuck up the arse kind of intellectual,
Okay.
and she was like, they were like unicorns to each other. They were just, like, what are you? Oh, what are you? And so in all of their years of exile, she became his connection to his Irishness, and his, what I like to call his rock and portable Ireland, throughout all the years of exile. So to answer your question, it was the conversation about Joyce's dying 15 minutes before Nora got back to his hospital.
I remember I got, like, probably the reason that I got into Joyce's work is I heard that, like, I'd read a little bit of his stuff in high school or whatever, and I was kind of like, whatever. But then I heard that his last words were like, doesn't anybody understand or whatever? And like that, I don't know, there's something about his death that I think is very attractive is kind of a creepy word to use, but like, I think it is.
The night before he died, they had escaped Paris, as the Nazis were coming in. They were actually in south of France, and then escaped on a train to Zurich, and they were there, I think, about 2 weeks. I actually don't recall the exact amount of time they were there, but I think it was about 2 weeks that they had been there. And the night before he died, Joyce was a tremendous hypochondriac.
Okay.
Aside from the fact that he was, he was practically blind at this point in his life. He felt very weak and alone. He had to leave his daughter in an institution, in an insane asylum in Paris, and which I can't even imagine. A war is coming and you're leaving your child behind. Giorgio went with them, but the night before he passed, he got on a table. It's also one of the reasons that people have said to me, so James Joyce a musical? I said, yeah, this guy was just, he would just as soon get up on this table right here and sing you the answer. He was that kind of a character. And the night before he passed, he got up on a table in this little cafe in Zurich and was singing the Marseillaise, just as a, we will survive all of this, and collapsed. And what I was getting at is he always imagined, terrible things, were happening. Meanwhile, some terrible things were happening to him, but because of, Freud and Carl Jung were very much in his sphere at the time. He was convinced that his stomach problems were, a result of his angst and his concerns over A, going blind, B, not necessarily in this order, but over Lucia and everything that was going on, the war. It was just awful time. And the man was only 59 years old. But, when you see pictures of him, he looks like he's, in his 80s by that point. So it was a, his death was, and then Ireland wouldn't take his body.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and as a matter of fact, I don't remember if it was in the 60s or in the 70s, they finally were like, maybe we should have James Joyce buried here. And the family was like, no, thank you.
We're good.
He had a love-hate relationship because the Irish Catholic Church, because of their hold and censorship and his inability to be published in Ireland. I don't know if you know the story of how Ulysses was actually got published. Censorship at that time was really harsh. You would be put in jail, you would lose all your money, and it was harsh. And so nobody would publish Ulysses for fear of censorship. So what happened was, before they moved to Paris, they were, you know, enticed to come to Paris through Ezra Pound and through Harriet Weaver as a supporter. And Ezra Pound, before he became the, you know, kind of notorious person that he became during World War II, Pound was an incredible book editor and supporter of other writers. And he saw the genius in Joyce, and Joyce was getting published in little, he would get, you know, little snippets of Ulysses in magazines. So he became famous. He was starting to become famous. He was like this little young rock star rising. Meanwhile, there were no royalties, so he was still, you know, living in penury. You know, he was still incredibly poor, and so by the time he gets to Paris, he's still getting rejected by everybody. And Paris at the time was an amazing place. F. Scott Fitzgerald, I mean, you name it, everybody was there, right? And so he can't get published, but finally, Pound introduces him to an expat, a U.S. expat of Sylvia Beach. And Sylvia wasn't married to this woman, but it was her partner, who was French, who knew French-speaking typesetters. And because they didn't speak English, that's how they got Ulysses published the first time. And of course, there were a million mistakes, which Joyce was correcting right up to the last minute, but that's how the first 1,000 copies of Ulysses got printed by typesetters that did not understand what they were printing. It was women who really made Joyce happen. So, you know, so there's Sylvia Beach, you know, Nora just being, he's been called the prick with the stick, you know, because he used to walk with a cane, you know, he was not always the nicest fellow, you know. But you also have to imagine, if you've ever met someone who is in another universe of smart, you know, there's a lyric at the end of Act 1 in the show that, you know, how do you paint a painting that no one else will see, you know, and how do you create something that no one will understand, and how do you keep going? But he was so dedicated to just, that's what he lived for. You know, when you're a writer, it's all you can do. You know, it's the only thing, it's not the only thing you know how to do, but it's the only thing that you know how to live for, gives you happiness. But Nora stuck with this guy. We do a song in the middle of Act 1 called Stand Fast, where he's just been a total jerk. And so picture this, early 1900s, Nora leaves Galway. She is a teenage girl, young Catholic girl, and moves to Dublin. And that was a big deal. While in Galway, she used to, you know, women weren't allowed unaccompanied on the street at night. So she used to dress up as a man and walk, you know, because she was curious, and she was a force in nature, you know, and an amazing storyteller. She could, you know, really tell a great Irish story and make you laugh, which is, I think, part of the attraction that Joyce had to her as well. But just picture, so here's this woman, and she's working at Finn's Hotel, you know, a young single woman trying to, you know, maintain some sense of decorum, I guess, you know. But it was a big deal. And Joyce, you know, they meet, you know, on June 16th, or they consummate their date. You know, there's a lot of talk about what Bloomsday, you know, really was. You know, it was most likely, you know, a hand job, frankly, is what happened on Bloomsday. And, you know, by September, he convinces her to leave Ireland and go into exile with him, unmarried.
Jeez. Yeah. Not great.
unmarried, and these were different times.
Mhm.
And then has two children with him, unmarried.
Not great.
This was a brave woman, and she stuck with him all through some of his, drunken ravings,
Mhm.
and so the thrust of the musical is really Nora wondering if she ever got the credit for everything that she had done. And what she realizes by the end of the show is that, or what in her imagination, she hears Joyce saying that, and there's a true love letter, that everything real and noble that I write, I believe, comes from you. And I've paraphrased it slightly, and that really did inspire the whole thrust of the play, and that this missing 15 minutes, which takes 2 hours to get through, is her realization that she was in every word of at least Ulysses. The little bit of study I did further was, I believe, Finnegan's is is primarily inspired by Lucia, his daughter.
Okay.
And have you gotten through Finnegan's?
I'm reading it right now. I have about 90 pages left, well, of my first circle around. But of course, once you reach the end, you just have to go right back to the beginning. So
I found that when I was reading Joyce, that I do a similar thing when reading Shakespeare, which is I read it out loud. And I believe that Joyce is meant to be heard. There is there is a feeling in the sound of the words, and Gaelic in particular is very much like that. There is an energy or a feeling, and I believe that so strongly that in the middle of our first act, when Joyce was reduced to teaching English to Italians in Italy, because he had been scammed thinking that he had a teaching job, and winds up teaching, some business people's children and people who wanted to learn English. But, that had, for an Irishman to be teaching English, had a certain irony to it at the time. But he was trying to convey in the show, he's missing home terribly, but in denial of it. And so what we wound up writing was a list of names of all the Irish towns. It starts with River Liffey from being the center of Dublin. And then it's just a list, a cacophony of names, which when said out loud created a feeling. And so when I was reading this just list of names, it's almost like a geography lesson of Ireland. it just can, because they're Gaelic words, it just conveyed a feeling. And so in the number River Liffey, in the musical, he's able to communicate beyond the written word. And my point there is that I think that there is something within the pages of Ulysses and Joyce's work that communicates of feelings. I don't think, there were times that, he wanted to challenge every intellectual on the planet and say, okay, you can spend the next 1,000 years figuring this shit out. But more than anything, he was conveying, for me, he was conveying the feeling and the sense of Irishness, that what that felt like, and what behind the words. It was not, words are an indication or a map, if you will, of an emotional journey. And I think what Joyce was really hooked into was, getting beyond the logic necessarily, and getting to the communicating something on a deeper level, which is why I think people are, after 100 years, people are, still, Ulysses is still selling 100,000 copies a year. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really, that's fantastic. No, I really like how you talk about like capturing the like musicality of Joyce, because I think it's something that a lot, like I've found when I'm sort of like studying Joyce or talking about him in a classroom setting, people like, you know, your prof will always lecture, oh yes, you know, the music in Joyce, it's very important, but you don't really like experience it, you know? And I think reading aloud, like you said, is a great way to capture that. Also, going to a musical about Joyce would be a great way to capture
Absolutely.
that. I think so.
And it's funny, I used to read on the treadmill out loud,
Oh,
because what
wow.
happens what happens is there's more oxygen going to your brain, because
Oh,
it can kind of roll over you after a while, right?
mhm,
And but if you're on a treadmill for, and I don't mean running, I mean like a nice walk or brisk
mhm.
walk, and there's more oxygen going to your brain, and I just found that incredibly stimulating,
Wow.
and got me into. So I recommend that highly for your students. Get on the treadmill, put it at 3.3 or 3.8, and read it out loud.
That's
People think you're
fantastic.
crazy, but so what?
Yeah, I feel like when you're at the point of reading Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, people will already think you're crazy enough that you might as well just use
There,
whatever reading strategy you can.
there's an interesting quote by Carl Jung in a letter into Joyce, that when Lucia was, just before she was institutionalized, because Jung, I believe, did an analysis um, of Lucia, and yet, full transparency, I wouldn't say anymore, but I was more of a Freudian guy than I was Carl Jung, and they had a big falling out. But
Mhm.
that full transparency. But Jung, because Jung had his own sexual issues, that were interesting. So, but that's a whole other master's thesis for talk about another time. It, Jung said that Joyce really knew how to dive deep into the subconscious, and what was so special about his relationship with Lucia is that she did too. The problem was with Lucia, she did not know how to swim back up,
Mm.
and it's almost like Kabbalistic studies. You're not supposed to do those kinds of studies until you are much older and really grounded, and be balanced in certain ways, because when you open those and unlock the keys to those kinds of doors, reality can become a little confusing. Um, and so that was my interpretation and at the same time, who knows, given what people's perspectives were at the time of what either, schizophrenia was, or who knows what she would have been diagnosed with. And by the way, she
Mhm.
outlived them all.
Yeah.
She outlived them all, and God bless. And she always had a crush on Sammy Beckett, and and always asked about him when she was visited, even in the 1950s. She would still remember that, but that poor woman went through shock treatment, and oh god,
Mhm. Yeah.
it was a
Have
different
you
time.
mhm. Have you ever read they called Lucia Mad? I feel like it definitely focuses on like her relationship with Beckett and that sort of thing. Kind of a bit too much for my taste, but I think you'd be
Yeah,
interested anyway.
it would be
Like,
fast. I spent many years. um it was tricky doing a play about Joyce,
mhm,
more so in the early 2000s and at the end of the 90s, because people were a lot more precious about Joyce,
okay.
and about the same way that you were sort of inferring that your professor might, oh yes, the music of Joyce, versus the, come on, it's just what it is, right?
Yeah.
And, and um, people were a lot more precious, especially in Ireland, for God's sakes, who refused to even recognize, even take his body. It was such a dichotomy of,
Mhm.
of feeling. So what that did to me was made me really want to get it right for the Joyceans, as well as storytelling for theater. There's
Mhm.
two very different things.
Yeah.
There's a funny expression in theater, never let the facts get in the way of telling a good story. And so I could not do that, in, while creating a piece about Joyce. And I also felt something that I feel whenever I dig into a new piece. When you create a musical,
Mhm.
it's like a new marriage. You are going to be living with those people for a long time.
Mhm.
And, with Joyce, it took me to get it right and to do it the right way, it took 20 years. It was just not something I recommend for the faint-hearted, and it wasn't all I did during that time. I produced other shows as well, but um, musicals are an interesting, complicated beast that require many vocabularies and require collaboration.
Sure.
And I always tell all my writers, if you don't like collaborating, don't do a musical. Um, it's very it is a collaborative sport, and you have to really truly enjoy that, and you have to know how to listen, and because what you what you create um, is a result of everyone that's in the room.
Mhm.
So and there are people who don't function that way, but the best theater, I think, is created by you just try to be selective with who you let in the room, and then you have to have your heart on the table and just have an open heart and listen. And um, it's why I believe theater education is incredibly important, because it teaches our kids how to listen, how to collaborate, and how to be heard at the same time. Incredible skills that uh, are not, in the US anyway, taught necessarily, with all our testing that goes on here, and
Mhm.
our focus on testing.
Musical as a medium or as like a practice is so important, and I think works very well with Joyce. I don't know. I remember it was like my mom who told me about your show, because like I love musical theater and I'm a Joyce scholar. So she was like, what are the chances that like here are your two things together? But I think like what you said about collaboration is like really important to how it works, because I think a lot of what goes into our understanding of Joyce is like there's no way one person can understand Ulysses except for maybe Jim himself, I guess. But like I don't know, I found like my understanding of Joyce and his work has very much come from like listening to others and reading it with groups and like, collaboratively working on annotations and stuff. So I don't know. I liked what you said there. I think it cleared up sort of like a nice, like connection and like an explanation as to why it works so well to have it in a musical. But
It's interesting. I mean, you have to imagine that here was a guy. There were maybe 5 people on the planet that were as smart and as well read.
mm,
So his associations were so vast that it requires who's going to get it all. And
yeah.
what's interesting is that he just wanted you to feel it. He didn't you don't have to understand it, just feel it. I think he would call all the puny heads, trying to understand every word. It's like, just feel it.
Yeah.
We can't live in Joyce's shoes, and yet at the same time, this collaborative thing. It's funny. My collaborator on my untitled project that I'm working on with Jake Bernstein, he was one of the I think it was like 300 writers that were from all around the world, that were reporters, investigative reporters, who worked on understanding the Panama Papers.
Mhm.
and getting, they had 2 terabytes or 3 terabytes of papers, and they got reporters from like 80 cities and 60 countries
Mhm.
to all work together to create this, their own form of like Facebook, if you will. It was a
Wow.
private platform, right?
Mhm.
So they created their own little private thing where they would post about a particular topic, and how they would each, add their own expertise to it, so that the Russians would understand, how to interpret the, things going on with the oligarchs, and everyone would put in their thing onto this like metaverse that was created just for them. And because of that, and because of that collaboration and that transparency, information was gotten out to the public. And so what's so wonderful about today's world, and about, I've had the honor and the pleasure of, going to Joyce symposiums. I was at the one in Amsterdam, and talking about the show. Um, what's so wonderful is that collaboration and that sharing of information, and no one's ever going to know every association that Joyce had when writing a paragraph.
Mhm.
You know, it might, there might be some obvious ones, but it would, Joyce himself said, you can study it for 1,000 years, you still won't get it.
Yeah.
But that wasn't his point. It's like it was sort of him creating, his own version of a crossword puzzle, if you will, while conveying a feeling of what in Ulysses anyway, of what 24 hours might have been like on the streets of Dublin for 24 hours. And because he was a genius, he was able to put on all those other layers as well. Um, but yeah, but what I became mostly fascinated with, and what always fascinates me, are people. And
Mhm.
so I was completely struck by Nora, and taken in by Nora and her strength. And you know, these were not two perfect people, and as parents, know,
Not great.
not great parents. And but at the end of the day, we're all humans, and which is, I think, a big life lesson for any child growing up. And the day that you realize your parent is just another human struggling as much as you are, or succeeding as much as you are, or a combination of both, because nobody is any one thing. You learn that when writing, you know, we are complicated creatures. Um, but Nora was indeed complicated, did have some incredible, jealousy issues with Lucia. Who knows what triggered what? Um, but I'm telling you, there'd be no Joyce without her. And part of my mission in doing the musical and staying with it so long was wanting that to be known.
Hmm.
I'm generally on a mission when I'm creating a musical.
That's fantastic. Do you know what type of like people have sort of like taken up your musical the most? Like, is it at the like symposia with academics that sort of glean onto it, or is it like people who
It's
haven't heard of Joyce before?
um, no, what I'm working on a new platform for musicals, of which we will do, himself and Nora, out there to get it to the world. It's only received a couple of productions, including the off-Broadway version that we did, and it really needs to get out there more. I'll tell you, I get requests for music all the time
Mhm.
from it, and it's generally young women who relate to Nora's strength. And there is a song called "Stand Fast" that's in it, and um, people generally, young women, like to audition with that song, and
Ah,
just to show their strength, and to it's a good theater song starts in one place and ends in another. And so it's a good song, and with pop theater with Irish feeling to it that does really well. Um, you know, I've done classes in Warsaw, you know, remotely.
Mhm.
There are, but when I say classes, it's really about, I'm not the, you know, typical, you know, professor kind of guy.
Mhm.
You know, I'm about the people and about how things feel.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's, so I guess people who are, you know, like, oh my God, I never knew that. What was so cool when people came to see the show, especially husbands who were dragged there, um, they were like, wow, I never knew that. You know, in theater, I was very, our marketing people who were fantastic, were very careful not to promote the Joyce aspect of it too much because it would have scared people away. And
Okay.
so what we did was, and what the show does is welcome you into this world where you discover all of these things, and you discover James Joyce, and you discover Nora, when it's framed in this story with how these two people who were just so hot for each other um, survived um, um, exile, um, being, you know, survived penury, survived his blindness, survived all sorts of illness, and yet still is one of the greatest, and to help create one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Um, I think it's an amazing story, and you know, and it's funny. The opening song explains what himself and Nora, why the title. First of all, he's the Grand himself. You know, he's just so. But it was always and Nora, never Nora first.
Mm.
Whereas back in the day, Nora was with him at every interview. Was never reported that she was there because women weren't reported on at,
Mhm.
during that day,
Mhm.
and so. And that's her complaint in the opening. It's always and Nora, and Nora. What happened to Nora first? And so that the play really, the musical really does try to answer that. And when she realizes that she's kind of in every word in Ulysses, it's or in every truthful word that he writes. It's interesting. It's interesting.
I have a question about your like reading of Joyce. So you said that you didn't really like read his stuff like much before. Was like reading his work, and like you can, if you want, like tell me like what of his work you've read, was that like mostly to do with like research for the show, or have you like continued reading his work afterwards, or how did it fit in?
Um, I think the first, I think I read the stories first,
Mhm.
you know, as sort of the introduction, which is what I usually recommend, you know, to people.
Me too.
And then I read Portrait, um, which was very revealing, you know, about his childhood. Um, and it was after that that I dug into Ulysses several times. But my main reading was, you know, all of the biographies and the, you know, the Maddox book, the you know, the Brenda's book is an amazing book. You know, the official, you know, the Element book. It was a lot of, I had a lot of reading to do.
For sure.
Um, and so, and I never really focused as much on his work.
Okay.
It was really about their lives. And I visited, oh, I've been to Ireland many, many times, and have performed the show at the James Joyce Center
Oh.
in Dublin twice.
Oh,
Actually, once I did it and I played Joyce, and I
that's
and
so
I
fun.
it was incredibly fun. And on Bloomsday, by the way, and we had
Fantastic.
people hanging out of the rafters practically, list wanting, you know, to be part of this. I stood under the picture of his da, and Nora's portrait was on the other side, and sang the songs from that Joyce sang. I brought a couple of actors with me too, and we did about a 45-minute presentation that year. And then the following year, the Joyce Center sponsor invited us back, and we went to Dundrum, just outside of Dublin, and did about 2 weeks at the Mill Theatre there. And so we did it there as well. And worked with an Irish director, really lovely guy, and helped us put that together there. Ireland is one of my favorite places to visit. I've gone there many, many times. I've done everything crazy from riding horseback in the Wicklow Mountains from pub to pub over 7 days, which was the trip that I would absolutely recommend.
Fantastic.
And it's funny, once you're outside of Dublin,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people in the West don't think Dublin's really Ireland. It's not very, Gaelic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
The West Coast is just gorgeous, just gorgeous, and it's a magical place. There's, and I've been accused of having magical thinking, but who wouldn't in theater, and otherwise, like, why would you do this? But Ireland's a magical place. There are several on the planet, and Ireland is one of them. And it's also important to make sure you know where the town's whiskey is very, it's very telling. It's important to have good Irish whiskey, and I will tell you that my favorite is from the town of Connemara, which is very peaty. Because the earth there's so much peat there. And so it has a very peaty taste to it. And so I recommend that highly for all your listeners.
Sounds really good. I'll go just for that. Never mind the symposium.
Tell me what your thesis, is based on, or are you just gathering information at this point?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, this project isn't like directly related to my thesis, but one thing that's emerged, just sort of happenstance, a lot of people, yourself included, have brought up like Catholicism and how much that sort of had an impact on Joyce and his work. And so my project is, obviously it's a thesis, so I need more than just Joyce, but he's definitely my sort of hub. But my project is about like representations of the sacrament of confession. So obviously portrait, there's the big one where Stephen kind of in a panic runs to the priest, and then lots of characters in Ulysses think about it. So I don't know, I'll be looking at lots of different, it's mostly like Irish authors in the 20th century that I'm focusing on. So there's lots around it, but Joyce is definitely sort of my like sounding, my, whenever I'm not sure, it kind of grounds back in your Ulysses. So
there's a scene. It's either I think it's scene 2 in the musical where, or at the end of scene 2, where Joyce is at his mother's deathbed,
mm-hmm.
and he refuses to kneel.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the lyric is something like, I've been torn in two by you men of black and white. You betray me with guilt, you portenders of the light. I will kneel in the rooms of the Tour Lure looms. Anyway, his thing is, I won't kneel. I will stand for Ireland, but I will not. So I recommend, if you are looking for some source of his feeling about Catholicism, I believe he was a very spiritual man. He was a spiritual man who did not like the institution of the Irish Catholic Church.
Okay.
But underneath it all, I believe he was deeply spiritual. And the song, if you have if you're listening either on Spotify or the album, it's Land of Erin, of course. And and by the way, there are 2 cast recordings. One was featuring Whitney Basher as Nora, and the original one has more dialogue in it. And the woman who played Nora in that version was electrifying and terrific with Matt Bogart on stage.